There is a security camera recording that has existed for more than 20 years. It shows a man's face, clearly. Walking up to a counter, pulling out a gun, and shooting a store clerk dead in broad daylight. Investigators have watched that tape more times than they can count. They've frozen every frame of it, zoomed in on his hands, his jacket, the ring on his finger, and they still don't know his name. Somewhere out there, a man who once fantasized about killing strangers in small stores off a highway may still be alive, may still be free, and may still be watching the news whenever his own case comes up. An FBI profiler who studied him for years said something that's stuck with investigators ever since, that this man believes he's smarter than everyone hunting him. For 30 years, he's been right. This is the story of the killer some call the I-70 killer. 6 confirmed murders, possibly more. A weapon so rare that police had to hunt one down on an online auction site just to understand how it worked. And a video of his own face that still hasn't caught him. It started in Indianapolis on April 8th, 1992. Robin Fuldauer was 26 years old, managing a Payless shoe source near the highway. It was a Wednesday afternoon. A man walked in. Nothing about him stood out. Average height, sandy hair, the kind of face you'd forget by the time you left the parking lot. He waited until she was alone. Then he walked her to the back of the store and shot her once in the back of the head. He took less than $100 from the register. In a shoe store on a weekday afternoon, that register probably had more than that, just sitting in the drawer. He didn't seem to care. 3 days later, in Wichita, Kansas, 2 women were found dead inside a bridal shop called La Bride d'Elegance. Patricia Maggers was 32. Patricia Smith was 23. They'd both been shot the same way. Close range, back of the head, almost no struggle. This was supposed to be a quiet job, helping brides pick out veils and dresses. Instead, whoever walked into that shop that day executed 2 people and walked back out onto the street like nothing had happened. 16 days after that, on April 27th, the killer was back in Indiana. This time in Terre, Haute, at a small ceramics shop called Sylvia's, run by a woman's family. Except this time, the victim was a man. Michael McCown, 40 years old, with long hair and an earring. Investigators believe the killer saw him from a distance and assumed he was looking at another woman working alone. By the time he realized his mistake, it was already happening. One detective who worked the case later said the killer likely panicked, scared of a physical fight with a man, so he fired immediately instead of waiting. It's the only time in the entire spree the pattern broke. And it happened because of a mistake, not a change of heart. 6 days later, in St. Charles, Missouri, Nancy Kitzmiller was killed inside a shoe store called Boot Village. She was 24. And 4 days after that, May 7th, Sarah Blessing, 37, was murdered inside a small holistic gift shop in Raytown, Missouri, called the Store of Many Colors. 6 people, 3 states, 29 days. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Here's the part that still bothers the detectives who worked this case for decades. Every single one of these stores was small, independent, close to an exit off Interstate 70, and staffed that day by a woman working completely alone. He wasn't picking targets at random, he was scouting. And here's something almost nobody expects going into this story. The ballistics matched across every single scene, which is the only reason investigators even realized one man was responsible for murders in 3 different states. The gun that connected them all was almost stranger than the crimes themselves. It was an Irma Work model ET-22, a German-made .22 caliber target pistol with a barrel almost a foot long, produced for only a short stretch in the late 1960s before the company stopped making them. It wasn't concealable. It jammed constantly. Detectives in 2 different states independently called it one of the worst possible weapons a killer could have chosen. Charles got so desperate they bought an identical ET-22 through an online auction. Just to study how it worked, how it jammed, what its shell casings looked like under a microscope. They placed ads in gun collector magazines, hoping some stranger somewhere would recognize the model and remember who they'd sold one to. Nobody ever called back with the right answer. There was one more detail on those shell casings. traces of jeweler's rouge, a fine polishing compound used to smooth the internal mechanism of a gun so it feeds bullets more reliably. That's not something a casual gun owner does. That's someone who maintained this weapon like it mattered to him, someone who knew guns. FBI profiler Larry Ankrom spent years building a psychological picture of this man, and what he found wasn't a robber who panicked into murder. It was the opposite. Ankrom concluded the money was almost an afterthought, grabbed on the way out, never the actual goal. The killing was the goal. He believed this was a man who fantasized about these attacks beforehand, got a rush from how quickly he could execute them, and replayed the experience in his head afterward like a highlight reel. He would have followed the news coverage closely. He probably enjoyed being given a name by the press. Ankrom called him a coward. Someone who specifically targeted women alone, who needed the odds stacked entirely in his favor before he'd ever pull the trigger. And then, 18 months after the killings along I-70 stopped, something eerily similar started happening 400 miles away. On September 25th, 1993, Mary Ann Glasscock was shot once in the back of the head inside an antique store in Fort Worth, Texas. Just off the interstate, in a strip mall, almost nothing missing from the register. Weeks later, Amy Vess was killed the same way inside a small dance apparel shop in nearby Arlington. Fort Worth police called the similarities to the original case almost too close to ignore. One Indianapolis detective who'd worked the 1992 murders put it more bluntly than that. He said it has to be him. But here's the frustrating part. The murder weapon was never recovered in Texas, and the ballistics couldn't be confirmed either way. So this case now carries an asterisk. Investigators are split. Some call it the I-70 killer, evolved and moved on. Others aren't convinced. Then, in January of 1994, in Houston, something happened that almost never happens in cases like this one. Someone survived. Vicky Webb was working alone at a small gift shop when a man she never even heard approaching shot her once in the back of the neck. The bullet hit between two vertebrae, chipped bone, and by pure chance. A spinal abnormality nobody could have predicted. It ricocheted away from her spinal cord instead of through it. She didn't die, but she also didn't move. The man dragged her behind the counter while she lay there conscious and paralyzed. He put the gun to her forehead a second time. He pulled the trigger. It jammed. That same design flaw detectives had mocked for years. The one that made this gun such a strange choice for a killer. Maybe the only reason Vicky Webb is alive today. She survived, paralyzed from the neck down, and gave investigators the most detailed description anyone connected to this case has ever provided. Short. Gaunt. Skin deeply tanned and weathered, like someone who worked outdoors for a living. Long, shaggy blonde hair. A beige cardigan. Cowboy boots. Ballistics from that attack didn't match the original ET-22 either, which keeps even this case filed under possibly linked instead of confirmed. Which brings us back to that security tape. The day after Thanksgiving, in 2001, a man walked into a liquor store on Raytown Road in Terre, Haute, Indiana, right along Interstate 70, and picked up a few beers like an ordinary customer. Then he pulled a gun on Billy Brossman, the clerk behind the counter. Brossman handed over the register. The killer took a few bills, forced him to the back of the store, and shot him once in the head. Then he walked out and left the rest of the cash sitting untouched on the counter, along with the beer he'd grabbed and never paid for. Security cameras caught the entire thing. His face. His build. What looks like a wedding ring on his hand as he raises the gun. His fingerprints were on the beer cans, on the register. They were too smudged to ever identify him. More than 2 decades later, that footage still exists. His face is on file, in evidence, in a case folder somewhere in Indiana. And nobody has ever been able to put a name to it. In 2021, 5 different police departments, Indianapolis, Wichita, Terre Haute, St. Charles, and Raytown, formed a joint task force to look at the entire case again, this time with tools that didn't exist in 1992. Touch DNA. The kind of genetic evidence that can come from skin cells left behind on a surface someone simply touched. Evidence went out for testing. The first results, tied to the McCown murder in Terre Haute, came back inconclusive. Other pieces of evidence were still being processed, still waiting on results that, as of now, haven't led to a name being released publicly. A $25,000 reward still sits unclaimed. Somewhere between Indianapolis, Wichita, St. Charles, Raytown, Fort Worth, Arlington, Houston, and Terre, Haute. There's a man who once walked into small businesses staffed by women working alone and left knowing exactly how much damage he could do in under 60 seconds. If he's still alive, the FBI's own profile puts him somewhere in his late 50s to early 70s now. He may be someone's neighbor, someone's quiet coworker who never talks much about his past. Someone sitting in a doctor's waiting room right now, decades removed from a spree that took 8 known lives and nearly took a 9th. The tape is still out there. The gun was never found. And the man an FBI profiler once said believed he was smarter than everyone looking for him has, so far, never been proven wrong. If this one stuck with you, there's another case on this channel just as hard to shake. One where the evidence was even stranger, and the ending is even harder to believe.